not huge fans of incentives as it relates to retail, really, unless it's going to be a project or a retailer that's going to have a significant impact on your community. So when I say significant impact, that could be maybe a large amount of sales tax coming in from that retailer. It could be additional retail that's spurred along by this retailer or this development that you're incentivizing. So at the end of the day, you want to make sure the outcome is a win-win for both you, the community, but also the retailer. So again, at the Retail Coach, not huge fans of incentives, but realize they're necessary in certain situations.
And there are a couple of myths that seem to be kind of floating around out there about incentives that we certainly hear a lot from communities and from people that are kind of assuming that they have to offer incentives to retailers. And one of those is that retailers must receive incentives to be interested in a community development or retail space. And the other is that offering incentives will seal the deal for an undecided retailer. Are those necessarily always true, or are those things that just kind of depend?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's true every time. I've seen hundreds of retail deals that have happened without incentives. One of the problems you have right now is there are some of these municipalities that are just offering incentives to everyone. So not absolutely necessary for incentives to happen. I think of a deal that our CEO Kelly Kofer and myself were involved in several years back, where it was actually Target that was looking at two different communities right next to each other, and one of the communities offered about $1 million in cash for Target to come to the community. But at the end of the day, Target went to the other community that didn't offer any incentives because location is what mattered to them. So not absolutely 100% necessary to incentivize a retailer to get them to come to a community. And it doesn't necessarily mean an incentive is going to seal the deal for an undecided retailer. A lot of it comes down to location and other factors when a retailer is looking to locate in a community.
Awesome. Ray, in talking about when it does make sense to offer incentives to retailers, you have a lot of experience in looking at local incentives and then even in some cases state incentives. I know that a lot of communities and organizations, whether you're an economic development organization or a city, have different abilities and different incentives they can offer. But what are some local incentives that economic development organizations or cities can offer to retailers that might be interested?
Uh, well, there are a lot of things, and of course, my experience comes in the state of Texas, and so I'll be talking predominantly about Texas incentives, although each state has their own tool chest which you can use. One of the things are obviously direct cash grants that you can give. They're going to be, if you're trying to revitalize your downtown, maybe you've got a facade that needs redoing, or you've got that building downtown that really needs an occupant, so you're willing to help spruce up the building a little bit for the retailer. Signage programs as well. Even helping a retailer negotiate your particular community's regulatory process, whether it's helping them get the sign permit or maybe working through some issues or some variances that they need on the signs. Infrastructure, within Texas, within the Economic Development Act, you can certainly provide infrastructure for a project, whether it's retail or manufacturing. That may be extending a water line that they need, a sewer line, or helping with extending a road to a development or the pavement. So those kinds of things can be very important to the retailer. Now, one of the things that we do not use very often in Fairview is property tax abatements. In the state of Texas, you can do up to 10 years of abating part of the property tax. Now, there are some states, I know, for instance, in the state of Wisconsin, tax abatement is a bad word, and I believe in that state it's even constitutionally prohibited. So there's some states where you won't be able to do tax abatements. In Texas, you can up to 2 years on the city tax. It's up to the county to whether they participate. And school districts, very rarely will you get to do any kind of a tax abatement for a school district on especially on a retail project. The other thing in Texas, and probably one of the biggest keys, is a sales tax rebate. And in Texas, we call that a 380 agreement simply because it's listed under Chapter 380 of the Texas Local Government Code, where you can actually take and rebate to a developer or a retailer sales tax that their project generates. Now, one of the things that is key to Fairview is that we typically will have the retailer or the developer spend the money on the front side, and then we will pay them back through sales tax rebates. And depending on, we'll talk a little bit farther in the presentation, but where you go down that road depends on the value of that particular project to your community. The other thing from a local incentive is a tax increment financing district or a TERS, tax increment finance reinvestment zones. Those are mechanisms where you create an area, it's a geographical area, you create it prior to the retail being developed, and you would freeze the property values in there so that whatever taxing entity is receiving money from that taxing area doesn't lose anything. They still get what they're getting. But as property values increase in that area, in this case because of a retail development, you would then get that difference between where the property base was and what the property base is. That incremental difference would then go back, and you can use that to, again, help with infrastructure. You can use it for cash grants and things of that nature.
And I know we've talked about this, Ray, but from a state incentives perspective, there really aren't a lot of options. I know there's some workforce type things that you can do, but are there any state programs that you're aware of nationally that people can use, or is that something that's a little bit more limited?
Well, I'm not familiar with other states, but Texas doesn't really have incentive programs for retailer. Most of the state economic incentives, like the Enterprise Fund, you have to create primary jobs, and retail, while it's valuable to the community, doesn't typically create primary jobs. And you have to create a certain level of investment. However, there are some workforce programs in Texas that can help you train your employees. And sometimes, especially in retail, that can be extremely valuable, because as we understand the workforce coming today, one of the greatest needs that employers have is to train employees in the soft skills. Things like showing up to work on time, playing nice, and working together. And workforce has training that would allow development of those particular skills, and they're going to be dependent on the project, and you work through your local workforce board to find those.
Got it. And Ray and Aaron, would love to hear your perspective on this as well. You talked about the local incentives. I know there's probably some that you prefer better than others. Are there types of incentives that you think typically work a little bit better for retail? Any that you would try to avoid? How do you approach those?
Well, from the economic developer standpoint, since incentives should never make a project. In other words, if a project cannot stand on its own without incentives, you should not do that project in your community. I know it's sometimes hard for us as economic developers to walk away from a deal, but it's better not to do a deal than to do a bad deal. So you should never have a project that they actually need the incentives to make the numbers work, because that's a recipe for failure. I'm not a big fan of giving direct cash up front because you don't have as much control. I'm very much a fan of sales tax rebates where the developer has paid the money for the project up front and then gets paid back over time based on the sales tax that they produce. So you, as a community, can negotiate the length of time you want that to be. You can negotiate the percentage of sales tax that you want to rebate. And you should always have an end game on the rebates. And that end game should be time or a dollar value, whichever comes first. In other words, let's just say that you've got a $10 million economic development deal that the developer has $10 million that they put into the project that they want to recover with sales tax. Then you should negotiate a specific number of years for that amount of money. So let's say at the end of, you negotiate the years for 10 years. So let's say at the end of 5 years, the developer has received their $10 million back. Then you should have it written into the agreement that the agreement ends so that you don't keep paying money down the road. On the other hand, let's say at the end of 10 years that the developer hasn't generated yet the $10 million in sales tax revenue. Then that agreement should also end, because at that point you should be done with it, and their performance didn't equal their promise. And so they're the ones that pay for that, not you.
Right. I think that kind of plays into our next topic of pros and cons of offering incentives to retailers. Aaron, I know that you teach a basic economic development course in Texas and a few other states, and you talk about these with new economic developers. Can you walk us through some of the pros and cons of offering incentives to retailers, and maybe some positives and some things to look out for?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously there are pros and cons of offering incentives, and we've listed a couple here. I don't think this is all of them, but this is a good start. Some of the pros are it can create a competitive advantage for you over some of your surrounding or competing communities. Retailers, if they're looking at your community, they're likely looking at your competing communities as well, or those right around you. So it can offer that competitive advantage. It could, and it should stimulate additional development. If you're a smaller, more rural community and you're looking to incentivize somebody like a Walmart, for example, or maybe it could even be a very small community looking to incentivize a Dollar General or something like that. Typically, you don't see those retailers sit by themselves. Typically, additional retail comes with that. So it should help stimulate additional retail and restaurants, developments, and other services that go around those types of retail. And the way I look at it from a pro standpoint, and Ray kind of hit on this when he talked about not doing maybe a sales tax abatement, not having to offer 100% of that, rebating 100% of the sales tax, but maybe rebating 50% of that. So really 50% of something is better than 50% of nothing. So if you're looking to incentivize a retailer, just like Ray said, incentivize it maybe 50% of that yearly sales tax that comes in for that retailer, and then the other 50% comes to you. So again, 50% of something is better than 50% of nothing. From a con standpoint, new retailers may expect incentives if they've been used frequently in your community. One of the things I've found is once a retailer starts offering incentives to one retailer, they all start coming from them. They all start coming and asking for incentives. So you've got to be careful about that because they'll all start coming looking for a handout. So be careful about that. There's a delayed return on investment, so it does take time to recoup that investment through the sales tax. Ray hit on this, and I'll mention this too. I'm not a big fan of incentivizing with cash. To me, it's risky. There's just other ways to do it that are better. And then one of the other cons that we see is many times offering incentives to these national or maybe regional retailers. You start to see the smaller retailers become frustrated or they feel alienated because they haven't received incentives. So that's definitely a con as well. There are some things from a smaller business or a local business standpoint. We mentioned it in the slide before, but potentially maybe facade and improvement grants, or maybe it's a sign enhancement grant or a new sign grant. Those are some things that you can do national retail wise, but those also could be used with some of your local retailers and restaurants. So those are just a few of the pros and cons, but we're going to talk about this more, but make sure you really look at the impact an incentive is going to have on your community. So if you're incentivizing a retailer, what is that overall, what is that total impact? Maybe even consider doing an impact analysis. We did a webinar several months back with Impact Data Source, and we talked about the importance of understanding the impact, the importance of these impact analysis. So that's also something you could do to really understand the impact of that incentive, but also understand the impact of that retailer. What are their sales going to be over a 5-year period? What are they going to be on a yearly basis? So keep both these pros and cons in mind as you're doing this.
Yeah, I think, and just to add a couple of things, your point about alienating other businesses in your town, you need to look at the effect that a project will have, and you also need to look at political ramifications, because regardless of what state you're in, economic development organizations in some shape, form, or fashion, somewhere up the line, report to a political subdivision of elected officials. And so you don't want to do a deal that hurts a constituency in town. And here's a great example. You don't want to go incentivize a Home Depot if it's going to put out of business the local family hardware store that's been in your community for 70 years and sponsors your little league teams and is a big active part of the community. I mean, you have to really look at those decisions, and doing an analysis for somebody like Impact Data. There are a number of companies not just pushing their product, although they're a very good company. There are companies that you can just pay to get a one-off analysis done as to what's the impact of this project on your town. And you can also buy models where you can sit at your desk and you can play with the numbers. Do we do 50% rebate? Do we do a 40%? Do we do a 60%? What's the payout? And then what additionally is this going to cost us in public works and fire, police, all those other things that come with those decisions.
I think that's a good segue into our next topic of how to decide whether or not to offer incentives to retailers. And just a quick note, if you're tuning in, there's on the GoToWebinar control panel, there's a questions box off to the right. Feel free to type those questions in if you have questions as we go, and we'll get those to Ray and Aaron. And then we'll also have a Q&A session at the end here in a few minutes. But we're going to switch over to how to decide whether or not to offer incentives to retailers. And really the theme of this is just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And so we're going to look at how to assess the need in your community, how to know the expected returns and benefits, beware of potential pitfalls, know what you're willing to offer, and then don't negotiate against yourself. Aaron, one of the things that we always do in communities is help them assess the need or the demand in their community. What can an economic developer or a community leader do to assess their need in the community to determine whether or not they should incentivize a retailer?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that I think is important is to have a retail gap analysis or a retail leakage analysis run on your community. What that'll help you do, Austin, is that'll help you understand what specific retail sectors you have a leakage in, or money is leaving the community. There's a large gap there, and really, it would make sense to incentivize or even think about incentivizing those sectors that have gaps or leakages. You wouldn't want to do that for categories where you have a surplus, obviously. So a gap analysis would help you do that. If you have a large $20 million leakage in sporting goods, for example, maybe you would look at incentivizing something like a sporting goods store. So the gap analysis or the leakage analysis I'm talking about is a great place to start.
Yeah, I think that's extremely, extremely important, because you don't, like Aaron said, don't incentivize the wrong business. So know what you are, and there are certainly good companies that do that. We happen to use the Retail Coach for a gap analysis. We also had them do a retail trade area analysis for us, so that we not only knew what we were leaking, we also knew how far shoppers were coming into our community, so that we could have that information for developers and retailers that we're trying to recruit.
Ray, kind of building off that a little bit, can you talk a little bit about how that kind of bleeds into anticipating what the returns of an incentive are and kind of knowing the benefits going into it? You mentioned earlier you use kind of a model to play with that and look at it, but how would you anticipate what the return or the benefits would be of working with a retailer offering incentives?
Well, again, in my experiences with the impact data model, and there are other companies besides them that do that, but we have we purchase every year a subscription from Impact Data to a desktop model that, let's say you're bringing me a project and you tell me that you're going to invest $10 million in land and building, and you tell me that your sales are going to be X a year, and then that this percentage of your product are taxable goods. We can sit down and we can plug numbers in, and we can start to then, with this model, we can play with those numbers. We can say, okay, what's our cost? Because the model assumes cost of police and fire. For instance, let's say you're a smaller community and you bring in a fairly large retailer. Well, you're going to impact your police department. You're going to impact your fire department. Maybe they have to add 1 or 2 officers because of the extra activity that the retail is going to have in traffic, shoplifting, extra security needs, and those types of things. And maybe it causes you to have another piece of fire equipment because of that. So your model takes into account those types of things. And then you can look and say, okay, putting this development in is going to have a cost to the community of this. They're going to bring in this much sales tax, so we get this revenue to offset it. And so you can then say, okay, well, do we want to rebate 20%, 30%, 50%? And then how long will it take over time for this investment to pay for itself? How long until the community realizes a positive flow? And you should do that in advance before you even start negotiating with a retailer, so that you know where your position and stance is.
Right. And Ray, how important is it to also look at, historically what that specific retailer has been incentivized with in other communities, and then look at what other competing communities are offering as well? Does that play into that factor or factor into that at all?
Yes, it is. There are some ways, depending on the state and the community and the laws, that you can get copies of agreements that people have done. So if you know that this developer, this retailer has done a deal within a community within Texas, once that deal is executed and done, it's public knowledge. So you can get a copy of the deal and know all the deal points. It is sometimes a little bit difficult to know who your competition is, but if you will do the footwork to research your market, you can have an idea. If you're in a metropolitan area like Dallas or Austin or Houston, San Antonio, you may not know, because you could be competing against another city that's 2 cities over, but the corner's only a mile or so away from you. With data, you can get an idea of different retailers, and I don't know for sure, but this may be a service that you guys provide, but you can find out what their criteria for development is. In other words, let's say Company X, in order for them to put a place, they don't locate within X number of miles of another store. They have to have Y number of people in a retail trade area. They need to have this kind of a traffic count. So you can look at spaces by knowing your market, and you can tell if, to a certain extent, whether somebody's bluffing. You go, well, either we're going to put it here or we're going to go there. Sometimes you can look and you go, there's nothing over there that would work for them, and they're just trying to see how much they can get out of me. Or sometimes it's very real. You go, there is some good property over there, wherever there is. And so it comes to being a good economic developer and a good foot soldier and doing your due diligence.
Right. And Ray, that we have a question here, and where you were going leads into our next topic of beware of the pitfalls. I'm gonna read you a question we got here from an attendee, because I know you have some experience with this with the town center at Fairview. So we have a question that says, we have a retail developer that wants us to change our commercial zoning to allow retail and residential in a mixed use arrangement. We are mostly a suburban/rural township in Pennsylvania. The developer claims that he needs the residential component to support the shopping center. This is prime commercial land with utilities and infrastructure for large commercial buildings. We don't have much of that land left. They're not asking for incentives. However, our township is unsure of giving up commercially zoned land for a shopping center with apartments and residential units. Any thoughts on this?
Well, it's funny that you should mention Pennsylvania, because I actually lived in Pennsylvania, in central Pennsylvania, for a number of years while I'm a native Texan, and I got back here to get into economic development. I'm a little bit familiar with that part of the world and some of the things that you have there. You have to look at your town and what your goal and your vision is. This goes into a whole different webinar that we could have, but to put it as succinctly as I can, you should have a strategic plan. And in your strategic plan should be your goals and objectives for the development that you want. And everybody that has a strategic plan, that strategic plan has included public input. It has included your boards and elected officials. It has been ratified in some way. So in this particular case, I would look at, how large of the retail component, how large is the residential component? What would it take away from office? And in the case of a mixed use, the questions that I want to find out is, would this help us get office development? Would an office developer then come in and say, okay, here's a place for my people to live that can get to work? So, nearly every developer, and if there's some of you online, I'm not speaking rudely, because I love developers and they're key to the business, but I've never met a developer that doesn't cry poor even when their bank account's overflowing. And everybody needs something to make a shortcut. So you have to look at your community values, and if it's going to greatly disrupt your strategic plan and your community values, then I would say don't do it. If it's in a gray area where it may help you attract something else, then I think it's certainly worth having those discussions in a public forum.
Thanks, Ray. Aaron, I know that you've worked on a lot of large mixed-use retail developments in the last 4 or 5 years, and talk a lot about this state of the retail industry and new shopping centers. Do you have any thoughts on that situation?
I think we're seeing a lot, especially with the millennial generation, a lot of that mixed use, a lot of that convenience factor of it, living, working, playing all in the same area right there. So, I think you just have to look at that individually and look at what, is that population density that you're going to get with the apartments and the residential. Is that going to help you get a higher caliber of commercial, higher caliber of retail? Is it going to help you get a higher caliber of office? So I think you have to look at it that way. I'd probably have to look at that situation probably a little bit closer and individually to give a better answer than kind of that general answer I just gave.
Okay. Well, we'll certainly follow up on that.
Austin, this is Ray. If the person from Pennsylvania, I know you're going to put our contact information up at the end of this.
Mm-hmm.
If they will contact me offline and I can ask more questions, knowing a little bit about the state and where they are, I may be able to help them a little bit better.
Definitely. And I know same for you as well, Aaron, right?
Correct.
Great. So that kind of brings us back into the last couple of bullet points we have, and we'll get through those quickly so we can get to the Q&A. But really, we just kind of addressed it. Beware of potential pitfalls. In order for incentives to really make a difference in community and be successful in the community, there are a lot of things that have to line up. Ray mentioned a couple of things that you can do to avoid having mishaps or overlooking things, certainly data models and really looking at what you can do to avoid those things. Part of the process of avoiding those pitfalls is knowing what you're willing to offer. I'm sure many of you that are on here do already have a plan for investments, or for incentives, but if you don't, it's very important to invest time in developing an incentives program and know what you're willing to incentivize and what you're not before you start having those conversations with retailers. Ray, I know that you helped develop the incentives plan for Fairview. How would you help people start wrapping their minds around how to build an incentives program, and where do you start with that, and what does that look like?
Well, we formalized last year an incentive policy. It was input from staff and it was board. Our previous town manager, John Godwin, who is now in Paris, Texas, as city manager, negotiated the deal for the Fairview Town Center, which was originally the Village of Fairview. And so we took some of the things that were part of that agreement and made them in. And then we created a tax increment financing district. And so we just went through the bullet points and took several meetings to do this with the board, as to where they were comfortable, what they were comfortable in setting, to what level they were. And we developed these guidelines. Part of our incentive was to get the impact data model and to incorporate that in, so that if somebody comes to me now, all I have to do is flip open the policy manual and look and go, okay, the board generally is okay with these incentives provided you bring this value. And our incentives, you have to bring a certain amount of value to the table, or we're not really interested in incentives. So if you spend the time to do that, it makes negotiation a whole lot easier, because you can have things fairly well ironed out before you get to your board.
Great. And does that help with retailers and even larger commercial businesses that are coming to the community? Does it help to have a system and to be able to say, this is our process? It seems like that would kind of help make that whole process a little bit smoother.
You mean having a policy absolutely makes the process smoother.
Right. I think having a policy, Ray, though, you still need to look at each one individually. If a retailer's coming in or restaurant's coming in, you need to look at each of those individually to what kind of impact they're going to have in order to determine what type of incentive to give, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are communities that I know of in Texas that they're not going to incent any retail.
Yeah.
You either come or you don't come. There are communities that desperately need even a Dollar General or a supermarket. And those communities would incent a supermarket. They would incent a Dollar General or a Dollar Tree. And other communities would do everything they could to make the permitting process for some of those things difficult, because they don't particularly want them in their community.
Right.
So it is very much a community by community decision. Yeah, I'm not a genius in economic development, but I have two strong rules in economic development. Number one, know who you are as a community, and then number two, be who you are to the best of your ability.
Great point. Aaron, our TRC tip is know what incentives surrounding communities are offering so you can develop a competitive plan. I know that you have some experience in that. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about how you've done that in the past and how that's beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously you need to know what your competition's doing. You're competing with those communities directly around you, but you're also competing with communities in your region or in the state. So it's important to know what other maybe similar sized communities are doing to give you some ideas on what to offer, but also to know what you're up against. As I mentioned earlier in this webinar, retailers are probably looking at your community, but they're probably looking at your competing communities as well. So kind of know what you're up against there. One of the things that we did that worked really well for a community is they hired us to go out and they had a large gas station slash convenience store that's in Texas, is moving along the Gulf Coast now, called Buc-ee's. And they hired us. Buc-ee's will typically do about 50 million per store. And they hired us to figure out what incentives are these other communities giving Buc-ee's. So what we did is we went around to 5 or 7 other communities that recently done incentives packages with Buc-ee's, and we were able to identify those 5 through those 5 communities what they gave. And then when it was time for the community to go back and negotiate, work with Buc-ee's on what incentives to give, we were very smart in how we laid out that incentive policy or that incentive arrangement, because we knew what Buc-ee's was getting from others. So know what your competing communities are doing, obviously, so that you're know what you're up against, but also to help you identify maybe some other tools you could be using that maybe you're not already using.
Right.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and you have to do that. Of course, ultimately you have to figure out if the deal's worth it for your community and be willing to walk away from it if it's not.
And Ray, I think that gets into our next point of don't negotiate against yourself. Find out if the retailer that or the developer that you're looking at or that you're talking to is actually looking at other sites besides yours. Do enough due diligence and make sure you really need to offer incentives before making that offer. Ray, I know that you're very passionate about this topic of not really negotiating against yourself, but giving yourself room to be successful in those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, we've all watched the TV shows and the sitcom where they have a negotiate against yourself episode, whether it's buying a house or buying a car, and you're bidding yourself up. Well, there are times that a retailer will come in and they will intimate that they're looking somewhere else, and you have to become a really good poker player. You don't tip your hand, don't blink, and ask enough questions to find out what other sites that they're talking, what they would be looking at. And as I said previously, know your market so that you can know whether they're bluffing you. So that's real careful so that you don't just start giving stuff away. And if I know of cases where people have bought land in a community for retail, and after they bought the land and they're starting the planning process, then they go to economic development and go, what incentives are you going to give us? Okay, if they've already bought the land and started the planning process, call me old-fashioned, but my answer would be 0.
Yeah. Aaron, from the flip side of that, having been on the site selection side and working for retailers, is it common for a retailer if they ask for incentives and you don't necessarily give them 100% of what they want, that they'll just turn and run away if they're interested in community? Or is there typically leeway in that conversation to negotiate and work something out?
I think if a retailer is at the table and talking to you, they have interest in your community. Now, Ray mentioned this earlier, but incentives are not going to make or break a deal. And if they do, it's probably not the deal you want to go after. So if they're interested in your community, or if they're talking to you, they're interested in their community. There's some level of interest there. So work out an incentive deal that works for both parties, if it's necessary. I'll say it again. I've said it probably 3 times. We're not big fans of incentives at the Retail Coach, but if it's a project that's going to have a huge impact on your community, then it's worth incentivizing. Ray, that large retail development in your community, I would say that was probably a pretty good incentive. Would you agree?
Well, yeah, it was, and it has an expiration. And in the case of like I said, our previous town manager negotiated that deal, and it has an expiration on it. And in this case, they're not going to get back all the money that they put in there. The expiration will die. The agreement will die before they get back all their money. And so that way it had a time limit, but it was very good for the community. And we gave away 80% of the sales tax. So we only get about 20% of what it generates right now. However, we had nothing. So it was, at the time, the right deal at the right place. And that's what you have to do. You have to look at things as to whether that will be a catalyst for your community. Will it bring other development? The first person in usually gets a better deal. Will another retailer or developer get that kind of deal from us? Probably not. However, the right project still might get incentives. So
Yep.
You just have to pay attention to what you're doing.
Right. And in the marketing world, we often talk about SMART goals, and that acronym SMART certainly makes sense for retail incentives as well. So specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and then time bound, right? So all those things that you're talking about, Ray, of just making sure that you're smart when you're approaching it, and that you're not negotiating against yourself. You're knowing what to expect. You're looking at the pitfalls. All of those things culminate in, if you're going to give an incentive, having it work out for the community.
Definitely.
So,
yeah, you certainly don't want to have dumb goals as an economic developer, because in the end, you're the one that's going to be on the hook. So.
Right. And we've got a couple of examples on the screen of some community incentives programs. We talked about taking the time and investing time and just putting down on paper and documenting what your incentives program and incentives process is. We pulled a couple of examples, the first one being from Fairview, Texas, and then a couple from some larger communities that we've been in throughout the country. And really not too complicated. Ray, I don't know if you want to mention anything about that, but the goal being able to just clearly communicate what your vision is for how you use incentives, making sure that maps to your strategic plan, like you mentioned, Ray, and then just letting people know what the process is, so that if they're interested in those incentives, here's how you can connect with us and talk to us about that. Ray, do you want to add anything about the incentives program?
No, I think you covered it well. Just make sure that you've got the information out there, and most of all, the best way they can get in contact with the local economic developer.
Great. So a couple of additional resources that we just wanted to highlight before moving into the Q&A section is there are a lot of different resources out there for incentives, both at a local and state level. CCIM has some great resources on it. The Urban Institute does. There's a group called BLS that posts a state incentives resource guide every year. All of those things are available online. You can find those for kind of more in-depth, granular detail on incentives. If you're in the state of Texas, there's a great website called texasbusinessincentives.com where you can actually look and see agreements that have been made with local communities and retailers. So you can actually see how those agreements are set up. You can look at those to see what other communities around the state are doing, and to get some intelligence on how you can set up your agreements if you're looking at doing those as well. But tons of resources out there, a lot of great places to look if you're looking around for those. So we're going to go into Q&A now. We're going to stick around for about 10 or 15 minutes. So feel free to post your questions in that questions box, and we'll ask Ray and Aaron those questions. Aaron, one of the first questions we have is from someone who's in a mid-sized community of about 50,000 people. And they said they've done a leakage report, and they kind of know what they do need and don't need, but they want to know if when they're having conversations with retailers at places like the ICSC conferences, or they're going and meeting with retailers, if they should lead with incentives or they should just wait to see if those retailers are interested first. They said it's really tempting to lead with incentives, but it sounds like they shouldn't do that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, agree 100%. You never want to show all your cards at the front. So yeah, I would go into those meetings at ICSC, with incentives in your back pocket, so you have those if they're necessary. But I would hold off on that, because there's a good chance that retailer might not even ask for incentives.
Yeah, and not even. I mean, when you're at ICSC, you're mostly making introductions. I just stick to, yes, we have incentives available, and as we get farther along in your project, then we can look and see what you may qualify. Aaron's absolutely right. Don't put your cards on the table. And I will tell you, not always, but most of the time, I'm leery of any developer that leads with, what are your incentives? Because, again, you don't want to put out incentives and be stuck with a bad deal in your community.
Right. Another question, Ray, I think you'll probably be able to address this one. Our board is very passionate that they would like a Chick-fil-A, and they are willing to do everything possible to get a Chick-fil-A. Where should we draw the line with how much we're willing to give Chick-fil-A?
First, do not let any of your board members anywhere near anybody from Chick-fil-A. That's we kind of have policy that just staff goes to things like ICSC, because your elected officials, they are they're great. Most of them work without pay for the community. They don't have hidden agendas, and they're there to help the community. However, they can upset the apple cart, because I've seen them go, you tell us what you need and we'll do it to get here. Well, that's not a real good strategy. You need to figure out, first of all, and I'm not going to mention the company, but I have a board member he and his buddies have been passionate about one particular retailer coming to town. And I've had the retailer in twice. The developers had them in, and that retailer is not wanting to pay the rents that the developer needs to work it. They're about $20 a square foot apart. And so I just had to point blank tell the board member that we're not for them. And so you need to look at whether Chick-fil-A even fits in your community. You need to talk to a Chick-fil-A, and they've got development and real estate people. Talk to a Chick-fil-A representative and find out what kind of traffic counts they need, what kind of sales they need. And if your community doesn't have that, then you can use data to tell the people, hey, until this gets to this, they're not coming. So it's a very difficult position to be in, but sometimes we just have to be brutally honest with our constituencies.
Right. Aaron, I know you have some experience with this, and Ray, you do as well, but had a question. Are you familiar with hotel incentives? And what's the different approach there from retail incentives?
Well, I just did 2 hotel deals, so I'm extremely familiar with those. And again, can you tell me what state the person's from?
Let me ask.
Okay. Because if it's Texas, I can be more specific than.
Let's assume for now it's not Texas. Oh, it is Texas. Okay. I'm sorry. It is, Ray.
Okay. All right. In Texas, then I can speak very well of that. We had 0 hotels. hotels are something I've been fortunate in attracting. So our first hotel got a really good deal. Our first hotel, and they're both under construction and both should open within days of each other. Our first hotel is a Marriott Residence Inn, and we gave them, the Economic Development Corporation is providing $100,000 toward infrastructure, and being very conservative, that $100,000 is not paid until they have a certificate of occupancy. So if they don't complete their project and don't open, we're not out any money. Next, we are going to rebate them 45% of their hotel occupancy tax for a period of 11 years. Now, state law specifies what they have to spend that money on, which is basically the same thing that we do, which is marketing the hotel. So we laid out some accountability standards, and again, if that person would, contact me offline, I'd be glad to send you copies of the agreements. Now, the second hotel that came along is also an extended stay. It's a Hilton Home 2. They got 35% of the occupancy tax for 5 years and no cash towards infrastructure because they were number 2. We already had one. And number 3, unless it is just a really desirable boutique, they will probably get 0.
Got it. Aaron, anything you want to add? I know you work with a lot of hotel developers and just know a few of them.
Yeah, I'll just kind of echo what Ray said. I mean, I'm not retail, or hotels not typically considered retail, so we don't typically deal with that too much. I mean, I'm working with the community right now that's doing a hotel deal where they're rebating property tax. They're depending on the state you're in, you can repay some of your hotel tax that goes towards that. This community is incentivizing some of the infrastructure that was needed. So they're doing a cash outlay to get the infrastructure needed to this lot that the hotel is going on. So take that for what it's worth.
Great. So next question, I'll toss this up for both of you, and whoever wants to tackle it, just go ahead. But what's the best scenario for establishing a TERS? Existing development, as in the earlier example, or raw land?
Actually, both of those will work. Our TERS has both. We have it's predominantly raw land, but there was some existing development in Texas. You can't factor in retail area. I mean, not retail, residential area. And so we've got a little donut hole in it where there's residential. So all we did was freeze the tax value of the current commercial development that's there, and then the increment as that increases will go into the TERS.
So both work. There's not a ideal or preferred scenario of one versus the other.
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, obviously you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck if you put raw land under a TERS, because it's going to appreciate quicker and higher. But there's nothing wrong with putting existing property under a TERS either.
Great. So, Aaron, I think this one might be a little bit more in your alley. We have a great downtown, but we don't get a lot of traffic to it. We're looking at doing an incentive package for some sign updates and some incentives for our downtown. Is this something that you would recommend? It seems like there's not as much of a payoff, but we feel like it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I highly recommend any kind of facade enhancement, any kind of sign enhancement programs for downtowns. Where I've seen them work the best is when it's like a matching grant program. So the business has to put up half of it, and then the EDC or the city will put up the other half. That's where I've seen it work the best, because you're not giving away everything, and that local business is having to invest into it. So that gives them some skin in the game, if you will. So yeah, huge fans of that. And typically what happens in those cases is when one business sees, another business or two other businesses take advantage of that facade enhancement or take advantage of that sign enhancement, it tends to be a domino effect. So yeah, we're big fans of that. Improving the downtown areas, that's a great way to do it.
Great. Next question, and I think this will be for either of y'all. We don't have a lot of support or money to give incentives. If you didn't have any resources to offer incentives, how would you approach going after retailers, and how would you sell yourself as a community without having the benefit of being able to offer those incentives?
Well, again, the majority of the deals that I'm seeing, they're not reliant on incentives. So incentives is something you need to keep in your back pocket for those projects that are going to have a huge impact on your community. You need to really sell your community as a trade area. Forget about the city limits population, town limits population, and sell it as a trade area. Have that gap analysis we talked about to show what the demand is, what the potential is, and if you can prove to these retailers that there's a market, that there's demand, that they're going to make money, they're going to be successful, they'll locate in your community. Incentives are not. So you might have to work a little bit harder, but really focus on selling the trade area and that leakage analysis that we talked about.
Yeah, and the other thing to add to that is more important than incentives in your community is code enforcement, because long before you get down to negotiate with a retailer, they're going to drive your community. And if you've got a community that allows old cars up on blocks in the front yard, and you don't make things be cleaned up and spruced up, then they're not going to come to you. So I think your code enforcement and the appearance of your community is more important than any incentives.
Great. Well, thank you so much for everyone that attended. We're going to wrap up. If we have any questions that keep rolling in, we'll be sure to follow up offline. Either Aaron or Ray will follow up with you and answer that question and be available to you. You can reach Aaron or Ray through their email addresses. Ray's is rDunlap@fairviewtexas.org, and Aaron's is afarmer@theretailcoach.net. So feel free to reach out to them with any questions. And again, thank you for being here. This is a relatively new format for us. So if you found this helpful, let us know. Or if there was something that you felt like we could do better, we'd love to hear your feedback as well. But thanks so much, and have a great rest of the day. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Ray.
Thanks, Austin.